Hello friends, welcome back to DIY guitar making at Eric Schaefer Guitars. If you like what I do here and you want to learn more lutherie skills, check out ericschaeferguitars.com for my online courses and to see dates for my upcoming hands-on guitar build workshops. So what I'm doing today, I am going to be first unrolling this tube here of plans that I have. These are actually my own hand-drawn plans that I took to a copier, or a print shop I should say, and had them duplicate so that I can start to cannibalize these and put tracing paper over them and draw out new shapes and designs for the next guitar I'm building, which is guitar number 116, which will be a Florentine cutaway 13 fret to the body parlor guitar. Okay, so this is the set of plans that I'm most interested in today. What I'm going to be messing with is this Florentine cutaway shape and the fretboard a little bit, the fretboard design, basically how the tongue is going to interact with the sound hole and the cutaway. And, you know, just trying to find something that speaks to me. So I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera just because it's a little easier to focus and think creatively that way. And then we will get to work on actually cutting out some of this material, potentially making a fretboard, maybe doing some more work on the neck blank. I'm not really sure. We'll see. We will see where this takes me. Okay guys, so after a little bit of trial and error and back and forth on a couple different ideas, I actually ended up deciding to do something very traditional, which is simply to marry up the fretboard end with the shape of the sound hole, which, by the way, happens to be the traditional way of doing the end of the fretboard on classical guitars. Now, it's not at all original or unheard of to do it on steel string guitars, but it is by far the #1 way of doing it on classical guitars. It's very much a classical thing, though it's not unheard of in the steel string world. But anyway, so I wanted to do something a little bit more traditional here for a couple reasons. One, I've just kind of realized with these parlor models over time looking at them that I have so many unorthodox things going on all at the same time with the headstock and the bridge shape. Florentine cutaway in and of itself is a little bit more modern stylistically. All of these things going on that actually it's nice to have something that harkens back to simplicity and tradition on here, even if it's just simply the end of the fretboard tongue. And then also, I want to point out that on the previous parlor guitars I did, here I've got one right here, I did a fretboard tongue like this. Now, I don't dislike what I did here, but it does intrude on the sound hole space quite a bit. This is a shape that I've used on much larger guitars, and in those cases it doesn't cover the sound hole nearly as much as it does here. But the interesting thing is, the more you cover the sound hole with the fretboard tongue, you are effectively making your aperture, your sound hole, smaller, and so your Helmholtz resonance of the sound box, which is decided by the relationship between the total volume of your sound box and the size of your sound hole. Because the sound hole is now smaller, because of this fretboard tongue, that relationship is going to be changed, and actually your Helmholtz resonance is going to, the pitch is going to go up. And so you'll, essentially a long way of saying you will end up with a more treble-leaning guitar. So it'll sound a little brighter, a little brasher than it would otherwise sound if you weren't covering part of the sound hole. So that was another reason I just wanted to check this out. Although I do want to point out, though, I might actually find that I like this smaller aperture sound hole. That it's really a subjective decision there. It's not going to affect the overall efficiency of the sound box and make it a poor sounding guitar. It's actually just going to, in my opinion, make it a different sounding guitar. And we'll see if I like you know, the smaller aperture there or the bigger one that we're going to get from doing this more traditional design here. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you guys, that there are, in this case, a combination of aesthetic and acoustic reasons for trying something new here. I'm always trying something new. we'll see what happens. I'm gonna make a template now for this sort of classical style fretboard, and we'll get going. We'll start cutting out that fretboard and all sorts of fun stuff. Alrighty. Alright friends, I made my template by retracing out on a smaller piece of tracing paper that drawing that I did earlier of the fretboard and sticking that down to a piece of MDF, and then cutting this out on the bandsaw and shaping it on the spindle sander and the belt sander and the disc sander as well. And and then what I did in my haste, and because I was listening to a podcast and just kind of off in la la land and not paying attention, I actually then just went right ahead and cut out my fretboard shape onto a piece of the Birdseye Maple here. And what you're looking at here on the top is my fix here, because I made a mistake, ladies and gentlemen. I cut out my fretboard before I cut the fret slots into it. I've actually never made that particular mistake before. I've made a lot of mistakes like this where you just simply have to come up with something to backtrack yourself. And in this case, I simply glued down a scrap of MDF that I had on the floor. It was actually the scrap that came off the side of this. Glued it down to here and then just sanded this edge at an angle to match it up, basically to get me back to square. So now if I take a square and hold it up to the very front of the fretboard where the nut slot is, I am perfectly square off of this surface. Because hey, for you guys who have done fret slotting before, which would be a good number of you, you know that we need to start out with a square blank to cut our fret slots so that the slots are square. If you've already shapered and tapered those ends, you're kind of screwed, because then when you run this, when you cut it either in a miter box with a handsaw, or you run it through the table saw, the powered method of cutting your fret slots, which is what I do. Either way, both of those methods rely on having one true square surface. Okay, so this was my way of just reclaiming that true square surface. And actually, this was not a very catastrophic mistake that I made. This probably took me, honestly, 10 minutes. I mean, I had to wait for the glue to dry, but aside from waiting for the glue to dry, sticking this on there and then sanding the edge to get it to match up, in total probably backtracked me 10 minutes. So anyway, once I have those slots cut, I can then just cut off this extra piece and you know, sand away the glue and stuff like that I now have on this edge to sort of reclaim my fretboard shape. All right, I thought you guys would find that at the very least amusing, if not a little bit helpful in your own journey. So let's keep going onward and upward to the next thing. All right, and so one of the challenges I have here in cutting these fret slots is that because I've already shaped the nut edge all the way down to where it's supposed to be, I don't have any extra leeway here. I have to make sure that this is lined up with the blade's right there, perfectly, so that blade is right against the edge there. And so the pin itself that this reference is in is offset by about 3 millimeters. And so that's what I've done here with this line. So I have something to line myself up with. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to use some tape to hold the fretboard in place on the fence perfectly where I want it, which is right there. Okay, you can't see the tape because it's under the fretboard. I'm still on my mark. I'm going to put a second piece of tape there just because, so it can't really rotate off of that mark. It's always better to have 2 clamps or 2 pieces of tape, basically 2 things holding something down at a minimum. Otherwise, it kind of pivots off of that point. Okay, still on my mark. Now I can lay out my double stick tape. Peel the backing off. And now I can place my template on, knowing fully well that, well, let me double check it, that I'm starting with the blade right against the nut slot. I gotta be perfect here. No extra wiggle room, unfortunately, because of my stupid mistake. Okay, let's go ahead and take this tape off here that was simply holding the fretboard in alignment on the fence exactly where I want it to be, because now I've got the template stuck down and it should be now in the perfect place. One final check here. Yeah, that worked. All right, let's get cutting. All right, moment of truth on that first cut there. This is what really tells you if I nailed it or not. And I did, because you can see it only cut into the MDF piece here. If I take some sort of straight edge and rest it in that cut, which I might do in just a moment, it should also rest perfectly against this edge. All right, so I'm going to double check that, but if all else is good, then I'm good, and I'm going to keep cutting. Okay guys, and there we have it. That worked out rather well. All right, next thing. Okie dokie, so that's all cleaned up now, the edges of this. It's back to normal, how it should be. And I know I'm going to be binding this fretboard, but I'm actually going to stop here. So later on, I will, at some point, much closer to the assembly stage, I'm going to install some ebony binding onto the sides, and I'm going to even bend a piece and get it right into this rounded over portion, so that'll look really sharp. But to do the final binding on here, I'm actually going to wait until I'm just before the assembly stage. And that's because, see, I brought you guys over here to this drawing for a reason. It's a little hard to see on the camera. It's kind of faint, but I think you can see it. That's because you can see that my round over here is intended to be perfectly in line with that sound hole. And so for that reason, I've left this area actually a little bit high, so a little bit further down. It should dip into the sound hole slightly at this point, and that's just because in a real world rather than a hypothetical perfect world, you never end up absolutely perfectly on your circle there. So if you leave it a little bit high, I still have a chance to adjust that before I stick the binding on there, which if I already had the binding on at this point, yeah, I could still adjust it a little bit, but it's gonna make the binding at the end look a little off because, you know, let's say I had to take a little more material off of this side rather than this side in order to true it up to the circle. Well, you'd be able to notice that. You'd be able to tell because the binding would look thin on this side and fat on this side. So really just for the purpose of getting this as good as it can possibly be, you leave a little extra on there, and we're going to do a tiny bit of final shaping before I attach the binding later on. Let's take a break from the fretboard then and move on to something else. I can do the top, I can work on the back. That's probably what I'm going to do now. I can profile those. Here, let me go get them. Okay, redwood top. Birdseye Maple back with a snazzy ebony stripe in the middle there. So I can go ahead and cut these out to shape. This is going to be a Florentine cutaway, so there's going to be, I got to get my cutaway shape there. And you know what else I don't have yet? I don't have a mold. I've got to build a Florentine cutaway mold for this, specific for that cutaway. So that's quite a bit of work to do as well. Anyway, I think this is good enough for one video. I appreciate you guys. Have a good one. Take care. And bye for now.
If you learned something here, please give this video a like and subscribe so you can be notified when I release a new DIY guitar making video. And if you want to really learn more, take one of my structured online courses at ericschaferguitars.com or register for a hands-on guitar building workshop here with me in Burnville, Pennsylvania.